A special thanks to my Patreon supporters. What is the scariest, unexplainable, thing that has happened to you? I think I'm being followed by death, and it is freaking me out. In 2006, I was 12 at the time. My dog escaped when I opened my front door, and got hit by a car in front of my eyes. This was at an intersection in New York City, so there were loads of cars. I had to run into the street and signal to the cars with my hands to stop driving so I could get to my dog. In the driver's seat of the car that I had stopped, I saw a young black woman with very short hair, maybe in her early 30s. She was just smiling at me. It made me angry that she saw that I was crying and holding my dying dog and was just smiling. I always thought it was weird, but didn't think about it for another 4 years. In 2010, my father passed away from liver cancer in a hospital in New York. I was in his room when I noticed that he had stopped breathing. I ran out of the room to get someone to help, though the hospital seemed rather empty at 2 a.m. I ran down the hallway to the reception desk of that floor and saw 2 nurses. I said, "My father has stopped breathing, someone please help," to one of the nurses. One of the nurses got up and started to call some of the doctors. The other nurse just smiled and stayed quiet, and looked exactly like the woman I saw in the car 4 years earlier. My heart stopped, but I didn't have time to dwell on it because of the situation. Just imagine everything going quiet and slowing down while her eyes stare at her and her smile widens amidst all of the chaos. It sends fucking shivers down my spine. My grandmother's funeral was this past Thursday. My mother and I were parking our car at the funeral home, when we heard our back window shattering as if a bullet had gone through it. I got out of the car to see what had happened, and it turned out that we had backed into a tree, which shattered the window. I ran inside the funeral home to see if they could give us a garbage bag and duct tape, and I saw the same woman on the sidewalk in front of the home, wearing a hat, looking at me, walking by, but I didn't have time to stop. Edit. People have said that it is possible that I am seeing a different woman each time and that I'm delusional/racist. I have considered this, but I will never forget the face that I saw. The twisted smile that was so out of place is burned into my mind forever and is as unmistakably the same woman each time. Not my story but my best friend's. When he was a kid he lived in this house that he swore up and down was haunted. Lots of weird moments of feeling like being watched, stuff turns up missing then showing up in random places. Well, him and his mom were watching TV one night while his stepdad was at work. They heard a loud thud in the basement and they both assumed it was the father messing around in the basement and he hadn't come up yet. They heard another thud and my friend's mom told him to go downstairs and see WTF his stepdad was doing and why he hadn't come up yet to say hello. So, he walked down the steps and found that the tiny, family dog was nailed to the ceiling by a claw hammer stuck through its chin. The basement door was locked and no one else was down there. They moved out of the house as soon as they could and apparently no one has lived there more than a year. He was apparently young enough to block it out of his memory, but it resurfaced when he was in therapy after the army. Gives me chills thinking about it. And yeah, I confirmed with his mom. My whole family is convinced that our cottage is haunted. About 3 years ago, my uncle's wife and her friends were up there on their own, 3 or 4 of them. They were sitting out on the deck right by the back door at about 1 a.m., shooting the shit. One of them says that they can see something on the rocks by the lake, so they all turned and all saw the same thing. It looked like a little boy climbing around on the rocks, playing, and he suddenly vanished. They were freaked out to say the least. Well, a couple days after that, they were talking to my grandma and grandpa about it, the owners of the cottage, and my grandma brought up that she had a very scary paranormal experience in one of the rooms. She was sleeping and was woken up by something pressing down on her chest really hard. She saw a little boy sitting on her chest and she tried to yell for help but she couldn't, so she just closed her eyes and prayed for it to go away. When she woke up, she thought she had just had the worst nightmare of her life, until she saw that she has 2 bruises on her chest, right where the pressure was. She did not bring this up until a couple years ago because she did not want to scare anyone from coming up. She did some investigating on her own and found out that the people who owned the cottage before us had a son who drowned in the lake. Crazy shit. I was staying at my grandma and grandpa's cabin in the mountains of Idaho junior year of college during spring break. My roomie and I decided to go up there from San Diego on a whim to get out of town for a while and just drink and ride apps and watch movies and just unwind a bit. He slept in a guest room and I slept in my grandparents' bed. They at the time lived elsewhere because they hadn't retired yet and this cabin was to be their retirement house. One morning when it was still quite early, everything was very blue as things tend to be at dawn. I woke up with a shock to see something standing over me on the left side of the bed. It was a dark hooded figure that I would best describe as essentially what a ringwraith from the Lord of the Rings movies. It stood for a second and then just seemed to melt to the ground and disappear. I couldn't move a muscle, not even my eyes. I was scared out of my mind and totally freaked out. I lay there in bed for about 10 minutes completely freaked out and praying. I am from a very Christian family. Finally I fell back asleep, then promptly woke up and forgot all about it for a couple weeks. Then one day I was walking to class and everything just randomly hit me all at once. Not only did I remember the event, but I remembered that my grandma had told me she experienced the same exact thing in her house in Illinois, where they still lived at the time, with something that sounded like the same thing standing at the left side of her bed standing over her in the night and then melting to the floor but not before audibly informing her that it was going to kill her. Freaked me out. I know about sleep paralysis and am aware that it very well could have been a dream, but regardless of whatever really happened, it scared the crap out of me. There is an older home that had people moving in and out constantly in my neighborhood. I think the longest anyone had lived in it that I had seen was a year. Besides that, every 3 to 4 months people moved out claiming creepy things happened in there. One summer night around midnight, I was riding my bike home from a friend's house, approximate a mile ride. As I was riding, I got closer and closer to the older home and I started to see this grayish shadowy floating figure in the middle of the road. I continued on thinking it was nothing. Out of nowhere as I approached it got instantly colder, like from 80 degrees to 40. I got goosebumps and could see my breath. I continued on. As soon as I got to and went through the shadow, my bike chain popped, and I crashed. I freaked out as the shadow headed towards me. I picked up my bike and sprinted the next a quarter mile home, successfully outrunning the shadow. The next morning after freaking out when I got home and my parents helping me to bed, I decided to ask them about the house. My mom said that they had heard from the previous owners of our house, that a man had killed his wife and children in there in the 50s, called the police on himself, then walked out to the middle of the road, waited for the cops to come, then offed himself. He was pronounced dead in the middle of the road shortly after midnight. This happened in 2006 in upstate New York. My friends and I were taking a camping trip upstate. We are from the city, and we arrived at the location at nighttime, so it was very dark. Everyone got off of the buses and we were all standing around outside of the cabins waiting to eat. I saw one of the chaperones, Bert, standing near some trees a few yards from the cabin. Bert is a tall, broad-shouldered guy, and he was wearing a black pea coat. I was with everyone else when I turned my head and I saw him, and he was gesturing for me to come closer. I started running toward him. He continued to gesture and encourage me to come closer to him. My brother, who was with the group, shouted behind me, "Fucking super." I turned around to see him and was about to tell him that I was going to Bert, but when I turned back around, he wasn't there. No one was there. He had vanished. I looked back at my brother and the rest of the group, and saw Bert with the other adults. So the question is, who the fudge was that? On a similar note, back in the early 90s my boyfriend arrived home from school early one day for some odd reason. Without being overly observant, he goes up to his room in the dark, quiet house, and grabs the phone to call his friend Frank. He hears his mom on the line talking to one of her other nurse friends about a patient. He hangs up the phone and waits a while, but curiously looks into the driveway, doesn't see his mother's car. He then searches the house, calling her name. No mom. A couple hours later her car pulls into the driveway, and he asks her if she came home for a minute that day. She hadn't. He then recounts the phone conversation. She claims that she had that exact conversation earlier, from work, 2 towns away, with another nurse who was also at work. Their home phone was in no way associated with the phones at the hospital. One night I was in my bed dozing off when suddenly the whole bed started to shake. Not fast but slow enough to be noticeable. This was in Singapore when there's no risk of tremors and whatnot. Temperature dropped like crazy and I heard my name being whispered. Stopped after a while, though needless to say I didn't get much sleep that night. Another encounter. I listened to classic pop, 70s/80s, and one night around 1 a.m. or so I was playing music from my phone. All of a sudden I heard someone else singing along. It was only for a moment, but if I didn't jump so badly then it would surely have continued. During the 7th month I frequently feel someone staring at me when I'm alone late at night at home. Black figures also can be seen in my peripheral vision at times. It scares the duck out of me. I lived in a pretty spooky New York City apartment for 3 years. The place was on 29th and 3rd, on the first floor in the back of a very old building. All of the windows looked out into a narrow brick alleyway, so naturally the place was very dark, all the time. When my roommate and I first moved in, we smelled something awful coming from the apartment next door. It was akin to rotting garbage and cooked cabbage. I figured perhaps it actually was garbage, because we all get lazy from time to time and don't want to put pants on to take out the trash. After a few weeks, though, I told the super about it, who knocked on the guy's door to no avail. A few days later I came home from class and there was a cleaning crew clearing out the place. Pretty sure what I was smelling all that time was dead guy funk. And that's when weird things began to happen. My roommate Audrey swore she heard something moving around in her closet on more than one occasion. NYC apartments are notoriously small, and this place was no exception. The closets in that place were tiny, scarcely large enough for a person to stand in and wedged into the corner of the room like an architectural afterthought. I chalked it up to mice or something. Those little fuckers had been eating my mac and cheese for months, until she said she actually saw movement in there. Like a shadow. Something dark. Nothing else happened for a while, until one night when Audrey was home alone taking her makeup off. It was always a long nightly ritual for her. She was standing in front of the mirror when something walked straight past the open door. As there was a wall right next to the bathroom, there's no logical place someone could have disappeared to. Oftentimes I would stay up late, painting in my room because I would always save my assignments for the last minute. Perhaps it was sleep deprivation or delirium, but I swear I'd see a figure standing in my doorway in the early morning hours. As soon as I'd turn my head, my heart racing, I'd see nothing. But here's the worst part. It was just a few months until we were about to move out. I was in my room working, a good 20 feet across from the bathroom, with my door opened, while Audrey was doing her makeup thing. All of a sudden she yells at me, telling me to get off. I lean back in my chair to look at her across the living room and she realizes I'm way too far away to have touched her. Something had grabbed her shoulder from behind and pulled her around. Something she didn't see in the mirror. She was shoved quickly, but not necessarily violently, by a hand that wasn't there. That place still gives me the creeps. I saw something in my grandmother's house when I was about 7 or 8. I remember it being near Christmas time and my whole family was at my grandmother's house. The house was set up, to get to the kitchen/dining area from the back room, where the TV and SNES was, I had to walk through the living room that nobody used and was closed off from the rest of the house by a set of French doors. Well, it was late at night and I was the last one to leave the back room. As I entered the living room from the back room, I noticed someone going through my grandmother's closet. I thought it was my oldest cousin, who must have been about 18. I asked him if he could grab me some of the candy that my grandmother kept on the top shelf of the closet. After I had said this, he turned to me and I realized that he wasn't my cousin. It was a black figure with burning red eyes. I looked directly into its eyes and it started to hiss at me. I ran out of the living room, crying and screaming, ran straight to the cousin I thought it was, and then punched him in the stomach. My family was confused and asked me what was wrong. I explained that my cousin had tried to scare me. They explained that he had been in the kitchen the whole time. I'm still not always comfortable sleeping in my grandmother's house, but I haven't seen anything in her house since. TLDR, I saw a demon in my grandma's house. This just happened. Sometimes to clear my head when I hit a problem while coding, I like to get a bit of exercise in. I started doing push-ups in the room I work in. About midway through a set the lights flickered out, then came back on. I lifted my head. Normally I do push-ups head down. I could see the bottom of the doorway through the gap of the desk at the front of the room. I could see someone's legs. I assumed someone else had come in, went to get up and the lights flickered off and on again and the doorway was clear. Walked around, everything was locked/closed, there was no one here. Creepy stuff, but it's not the first time something weird has happened here. I generally ignore it nowadays. Seeing a ghost in my dad's old house overseas. My cousin's family occupied the place for that time period. We would sometimes stay there some nights when we were on vacation. Since I was really young and there wasn't enough room, I would sleep in my cousin's bed. So this one night we're playing cards and it starts getting late. Parents come in and tuck us into sleep and I'm having problems sleeping as I was unfamiliar with the room. I try and lay on my stomach and then all of a sudden I feel something touching the back of my neck. I look at my cousin and he has already fallen asleep. I try swiping it away and it keeps happening all through the night. I just can't fall asleep. Then after a while it gets to the point that I'm feeling restless and I decide to turn around in bed. When this happens I see this really dark pitch black thing hovering above us. I try and scream, but nothing is coming out of my mouth. I'm frozen there for a couple of seconds before I close my eyes and just imagine I saw nothing. I turn around again and lay on my stomach. The same touching feeling on the back of my neck starts happening again. Somehow I fall asleep. The next night I end up sleeping in my parents' room and then for the rest of the trip I stay over at my grandma's house. I don't tell anybody about the incident. We're over at my dad's old place the next vacation we decide to take. I bring up the story to my aunt. She explains to me that when they were building the house, one of the builders had fallen off the roof and killed himself. People are always skeptical when I tell this story, but here's hoping Reddit is open-minded. Basically, we used to think our house was haunted. Not because of anything overtly spooky, but simply because strange things would happen. Things would vanish and reappear in an odd place a little while later, doors would shut themselves, nothing really ghostly. It was more of a family joke. An old woman was killed by her son in the house. She died in hospital but he pushed her down the stairs, that the old lady was bored. Anyway, it all kinda climaxed one night. The old lady ghost took it to a next level. It was about 3 a.m., and there was a huge crash in our kitchen. Naturally my parents woke up thinking we were being burgled and my dad ran downstairs. What he found was an incredibly strange scene and so he called me and my mum downstairs to have a look. There were no signs of entry, no smashed windows, doors still locked, and obviously no one in the house. In the middle of our kitchen floor was a drawer, not an artist, but a thing you put stuff in, standing on its side with all the utensils that were kept in it neatly positioned around it in a circle. Our dog was also backed into the corner trembling and whimpering. We kept him in the kitchen of a night. We've never really understood what happened there, just put it down to the old lady making her exit. Stuff stopped disappearing after that, doors no longer randomly slammed, except of course for natural reasons. It makes for an interesting story even though I'd prefer to have some more answers. I was in kindergarten, and my mom brought me home, same as every other day. Now, every other day I'd probably change clothes and go watch cartoons in the living room right away, but that day, for some odd reason, I went to me and my brother's room. We had a chandelier of sorts in there. It had 3 light bulbs covered by white glass globes, giving off warm yet dull light. It was the middle of the day, about 3 to 4 p.m. with the sun still glowing high in the sky. Straight from the door, without taking off my jacket or anything, I went to the hallway and turned on the lights. For reasons unknown to me till this day, the lights overloaded. If you've ever seen a normal light bulb fry up, you know that it glows briefly in a bright violet light and fizzes out. This happened here as well, the exception being that all 3 light bulbs and all 3 white globes literally exploded, shattering glass all over the room. I didn't get as much as a shard on me, but needless to say my mom was horrified at what had happened, and glad that I was okay. God knows what could have happened if someone had been inside the room and hadn't just slipped in their hand to turn on the lights. I used to live in an old flat in central Stockholm. History of the place was fairly interesting. It used to be the servants' quarters for a castle nearby, and was afterwards remodeled to fit the upper-class inhabitants of Stockholm. Anyway, young as I was, I found some book on how to practice witchcraft. It was given to my mom as a joke at some point. I did not believe in these things, so as a joke with some friends we decided to try out a few things from the book, evoking, etc. I believe I was around the age of 10. Shortly afterwards, things started happening. When I was trying to sleep at night, terrifying images would flash before my eyes and I would feel hands grasping at my limbs. After speaking to my parents, I wrote this of as a combination of my insomnia that had been present for years. We figured loss of sleep could result in nightmares and sleep paralysis. However, more things kept happening. I have always been an avid reader and keep stacks of books lying around my room. One night these started to get knocked over, and at the very same time I started hearing cursing, coming from the entire room at the same time, no specific origin. Similar things would happen almost every night around 3 a.m. I had nightmares about a narrow passageway in our flat, that I was running through it and gray hands grasped for my legs. Another time, I heard a sound almost as if small objects were being flicked against my closed door, again around 3 a.m. I figured it would be one of my sisters, so I attempted to open the door, no avail. Someone was pressing it shut. After a while of pulling, it swung open, revealed no one and a dead quiet house. As these things were becoming more frequent, I started seeing sinister-looking people walking up and down the hallway I kept having nightmares about. These things kept happening until I was 17 and finally moved out. There are more stories, however I have very little time at the moment. I believe a couple of weird things have happened in the flat to the rest of my family, but nothing significant nor as frequent as what happened to me. There have been occurrences since, but not as disturbing as the ones in that particular flat. This happened to me about 2 months ago. It was early September and my aunt had just passed away. It was night time and I had just gotten into bed. I pulled the blanket over myself and laid there for a few minutes trying to fall asleep. Suddenly I felt the blanket start to tighten around my foot. It literally felt like someone was pushing my foot down and squeezing the blanket. I immediately jumped out of bed and ran into the hall. I had no idea what had just happened. I just stood in the hallway shaken up trying to figure out what had just happened. I paced the hallway and then decided to tell my parents about what had just happened. My mom said it was just my aunt tucking me in, which didn't make me feel any better about what just happened. Since it was late, I went and sat in my room with the light on for a long while. Eventually, I did turn the light off and attempt to fall asleep. I didn't for quite a while.